Yeah, we apologize. We love China. We love, playing there. I know for both of us individually, we go there, once or twice a year. They show us the most important love. So, we appreciate them as a fan base, and we love everything, they're about, and we appreciate the support that they give us.
We love China. What was that nonsense we were saying about the protesters? Anyway, the Houston Rockets facing heat and a lot of Chinese companies cutting ties. It would not be the first time, but it's accelerated just over the last few days. Susan Lee joins us with some more details on that. Hey, Susan.
Hey, Neil, swift and severe. That was the reaction from China in reaction to Daryl Morey, who's the general manager of the Houston Rockets, and his tweet over the weekend saying, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." Now, there wasn't really an apology from the NBA, but they did say it was regrettable that so many Chinese fans were offended by this tweet. But the reaction from the business side was more severe, and that includes the Chinese Basketball Association saying they are suspending ties with the Houston Rockets. Also, the largest streamer, Tencent, along with Chinese state television, both saying they will no longer carry Houston Rockets games. Also, Li Ning, the sportswear maker, along with the Shanghai Pudong Development Bank, both say that they will stop working with the Houston Rockets. And this puts the NBA in a very tough position because they have long fought to protect the freedom of speech, but they recognize that China is the future for them, the largest international market. In fact, it's the most watched pro sports on Chinese TV. That's the NBA. More than 600 million stream the games, so you can imagine the hundreds of millions that actually watch it on television. But we also had U.S. politicians jumping into this controversy as well. That includes Ben Sasse. In a statement here, the Republican from Nebraska says that basketball fans, the American people more broadly, should have absolutely no doubt about what is happening here. The NBA wants money, and the Communist Party of China is asking them to deny the most basic of human rights. In response, the NBA issued a statement saying money is the most important thing. Also, Ted Cruz of Texas has called the NBA shameful, and Beto O'Rourke says the NBA is an embarrassment. Now, on the converse of that argument, it's interesting, another controversy is brewing in Hong Kong over the skateboarding shoemaker Vans. So originally they held this competition for a popular design, and this one, which depicts the Hong Kong protests, was actually one of the most popular ones, but I guess they went ahead of the curve and pulled it because they didn't want any controversy stemming from China. But as a result, they have Hong Kong now saying that they want to ban and they want to basically, go against what's happening with Vans and don't buy Vans shoes in the city. So let's call this a divisive topic. Back to you.
Put it mildly. Susan Lee, thank you very much. And to add insult to sort of protest injury here, South Park has had to face the fire, too, after a Banned in China episode that mocked Hollywood for shaping its content to please the Chinese government. Beijing responded by deleting all clips, all episodes, and discussions of the Comedy Central show. It's just a comedy show. Just everybody lighten up here. But regardless, I have my panel back with me. Jeannie Zaino, Paul Dietrich. We've got David Dietz. Jeannie, what do you think of all this?
Well, the two parts. I think, one thing, when we talk about risk to clients, this is going to be a case study in sort of a new wave of risk that corporations are facing, like the NBA, like the Rockets, like South Park Comedy Central, is that one employee can go out, tweet something, and have this dramatic impact on your business is really something we haven't seen. 10 years ago, you didn't see anything like that. So there's that part. The other part is absolutely astonishing to imagine that, you now have American companies who are coming down on somebody for supporting democratic protest.
Well, they don't want to hurt business,
and they don't want to hurt business. And so, but then do they face any backlash is also a question in the U.S. or elsewhere for this sort of attempt to, sort of pacify China. So they are in a very difficult situation here, and I think we have to recognize that.
David, I can understand China's response. It's predictable. I get that. I'm offended by ours.
Well, certainly you don't bite the hand that feeds you. And, of course, it is a very tricky situation now that, politicians are now, coming to the defense of the right for free speech. We believe that, too. But, of course, those politicians aren't also getting their donations from China so they can, take that tack.
So
we don't
where does this
believe
go?
in free speech. NBC's Saturday Night Live a couple weeks ago censored a comic for making jokes that they didn't like, and they took him off the show.
So we're just as guilty.
We're just as guilty. I think we ought to give comics a free pass. Comedy is supposed to be offensive.
And NBA general managers, right? Give everyone a free pass. Just say what they feel and not worry about retribution, right?
Right.
But can we say the difference is this is a state cutting off of free speech? You're talking NBC, I agree with you, but those are companies, right? So there's a difference.
But that doesn't surprise me, Jeannie. That doesn't.
But there's a difference.
But Jeannie, that's what they've always done. That's what they've always done. I thought what was changing in this environment is that we weren't going to take it anymore.
Well, I agree with you, and of course, you know, these corporations are, and they're going to hear it from politicians. But it's going to depend on whether there's an American, you know, sort of blowback on this thing, which I don't think we're going to see.
Yeah, I think the blowback started when it looked like we were a little too obsequious with this, but I kind of agree with Jenny that life and business will go on. I just thought maybe naively that our policy and posture has changed, that we weren't going to play these suck-up games.
Well, I mean, the reality is you don't have a constitutional right to do business in China. So the blowback from China was very expected. Certainly, the Houston Rocket employee is not going to be put in jail, so he still has his right to free speech, but it's going to cost him, and that's...
He may not have his job, though, pretty soon.
You have no constitutional entitlement to your job.
Well, you know, I had a dissident from Tiananmen Square days on my weekend show, and she was of the opinion that this whole Hong Kong thing is going to be settled the only way China knows how, violently, because while we might look at it rationally and say, all right, they would only hurt themselves as this business juggernaut. She remembers quite well how the world sort of shrugged its collective shoulders, protested a little bit, but life went on. Now, I pointed out to her, yeah, but now China has become this huge economic power. She still said, no, when push comes to shove, this is who they are.
She's right. Look at what they're doing to the Uyghurs.
Yeah.
I mean, they're in torture camps.
And this is a Muslim sect that better than 1 million strong, imprisoned and what have you. So nothing has changed. Should we do business with them?
We do business with all sorts of not so nice people in Africa and other countries.
And there'll be nothing to control that in whatever trade talks we
So let's look at it from the other side of the coin. What if China and Hong Kong just permits these protests to go on and on and on? Now, if you're a business that wants to do business in Hong Kong, you're going to go there because there's no law and order. So I think if they don't do something, eventually they're going to lose respect for the business community.
Well, it's how they resolve it, right?
Well, yeah, but, you know, if people are going to be unlawful, you're going to have to be, you know, use force at a certain point.
Wow.
How often have we been successful when we've tried to change other people's
With
countries?
apartheid in South Africa, we did it through economic pressure, right?
We did.
So we're going to apply the same here?
No. We're not going to. No.
And let's not forget, this is not a big part of the negotiations going on out of that we were just talking about.
Right.
And so, you know, there you go. So nothing's going to happen about it.
All right, on that upbeat note. Well,
sorry, Neil.
We have a lot more coming up. The Dow down 30. All right, Elizabeth Warren is challenging the Business Roundtable in more ways than one and saying that their beholden nature to shareholders is part of the problem. To Charles Payne, who says maybe that's the problem right there, what she's saying. Charles, good to see you. What's going on here?
You know, Neil, the Business Roundtable shocked the business world when they said profits are no longer the main driver for businesses. So Elizabeth Warren is saying, is that right? Then let me take you up on that. And I got to tell you, I think it's somewhat of a brilliant move on our part to remind the audience. They said, forget about profits. It's all about, quote unquote, stakeholders, to deliver value to customers, to invest in employees, foster diversification, inclusion, dignity, and respect. They wanted to deal fairly and ethically with their suppliers. They want to support the communities they work in. And then long term, yeah, it will generate value for our shareholders. So, you know, she's essentially saying that's my platform. I agree they should put up or shut up. I don't know that that's her platform.
Paul, you've been arguing that it's the way they do it in Germany, and that's not exactly been on fire lately, right?
Yeah, I mean, German companies have been stymied. They haven't been able to globally compete because they put labor unions exactly on the same plane as shareholders. And, you know, I mean, the Business Roundtable, you know, we can't forget that a lot of the Business Roundtable supported Democrats, Clinton over Trump.
Right. You're right. So that might be coming into play here.
But I don't actually believe they believe that. This is a PR strategy just for the public. I don't believe anybody on the Business Roundtable believes all that stuff.
Charles Payne, the Business Roundtable blinked on this, though, didn't it?
They blinked big time, huge. And I got to tell you, Neil, I hear where Paul's coming from, but something is changing. It's more than just corporate virtual signaling and getting rid of plastic straws. Something significant is changing, and that's going to have major ramifications for people watching the show in their portfolios and even the economy.
All right. The latest proof is probably the success of this movie, The Joker. This is a preview to coming attractions, I guess. That was a little artistic reference there. Poor, but get the point. This guy is the face of the stock market now.
Are you concerned about the slowdown in manufacturing?
I am. We're looking at that carefully. Some things beyond our control. I mean, the Boeing problem, they've stopped producing airplanes for a while. There's a GM strike with the UAW. Those things are not helping.
All right, that was Larry Kudlow. Anything can happen on a deal. That's kind of what he's saying here. Then you have the wild card of General Motors, the ongoing strike entering its 4th week, signs that thousands more are getting laid off as a result of the effect of this lasting as long as it has. My panel back with me, and I'm looking at this, Jeannie Zaino and Paul Dietrich and David Dietz. And David, the longer it drags on, the GM thing might be the bigger issue, not so much the China trade issue.
Well, I'm shocked that it hasn't already been a bigger issue. I mean, this is not your father's economy. It used to be that that drone strike on Saudi Arabia, the oil would go through the roof, and with the strike against the auto workers, this whole economy would be in the tank. But we're really not. And I guess it says to me that the auto industry is a much smaller part of the economy. People are deferring, holding off their cars. They want to take their Ubers and their Lyfts, and they're looking for the electric car, the next generation.
Well, now we're also taking out 7-year loans, right, and all that stuff.
No, but the one thing is, I would say, is that it may be a small part of the economy. It also has an outsized impact, like PR-wise, when you think about what's coming in the election, especially if the election is fought out in the Rust Belt like it was in 2016. And the president is going to have to win the Midwest. He's going to have to win those Rust Belt states, and that's where a lot of this focus is going to be.
He trails in states like Wisconsin and all of that. Now, that's on paper, and it's very early, as you reminded me, Paul, but how do you think it stacks up for the president in these industrial states?
I mean, this GM strike, it's not like consumers don't have a choice of other automobiles to buy if they want to buy them. This will have no effect on the overall U.S. economy. But
even if it drags on for a while.
Even if it drags on, it will just have no effect. Other manufacturers will do better. Ford will do better. Hyundai will do better. All of those sort of things. But I just don't see it having any major effect. And I don't see that it's going to necessarily get Trump voters to vote against him.
It is interesting that the thorny issue appears to be the companies' move toward electric cars where they need fewer workers. And those workers want guarantees and protections. And I can't see GM giving that right now.
They can't afford to because, I mean, their big competition is Tesla, and they don't face those same sort of pressures. Interestingly, a generation ago, the president would force both parties into the room. But today, General Motors has no support popularly because we bailed them out. And, of course, the workers have more votes in management in these key Rust Belt states. So I think Trump's on the sidelines.
We talked earlier, too, guys, about the consumer and how he or she is in pretty good shape, so much good shape, Bob, that they'll spend a record number of dollars to watch a very dark movie. The Joker, smashing box office records with $93.5 million, more than $230 million worldwide. It was deemed dark, depressing, all of that, but it made a lot of money.
Did you see it this weekend,
I did indeed.
You did?
I did indeed.
I was too scared. Was it frightening?
I thought he was brilliant.
They say he's amazing.
I have never seen such a dark, troubling character. If he misses out on an Oscar, there's something wrong. But anyway, it's an appeal, right?
Well, absolutely. It's that old marketing ploy. If you want people to actually use your product or see your show, get someone to ban it or talk about it.
Well, that did. The drama around that helped, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
scare people. Right?
Kids do not care about the political correctness of the liberal media or academics. Let them stay in their safe rooms so they're not offended. But what kind of a culture are we that we're afraid of a Marvel comic book villain making us do
Well, so
things
much
we
for the
don't wanna
notion.
do.
So much for the notion that you have to leave them happy. I mean, I don't want to give the movie away, but it won't leave you happy. I mean, it's not that.
The #2 movie was Stephen King's It,
Yeah.
and it's just as violent and just as depressing.
He was a more appealing clown, I feel like. I mean, but who am I to judge? In the meantime, Edward Lawrence right now is reporting that the Chinese Commerce Ministry that China is indeed ready to do a deal with the U.S. on parts of these negotiations. In other words, a partial deal. That fuels this argument that we're headed toward, a partial deal.
That looks to be where we're headed towards, and I would love to hear the president come out and say that he is open to that, and what part of that partial deal is he willing to
accept. If he put a
accept?
kibosh on that today and said, no, then the market would tank, right?
Well, absolutely. But still, I think we're really hoping for a small deal, because a small deal prevents a big blow-up. And so that's what the economy and the market's going to like.
Do you think that, given the time we've had, and you touched on at the outset, that we've waited so long for this, and it turns out to be a deal potentially that could have been scored many, many months ago, any effect or not?
Yeah, I disagree that this couldn't have been done many months ago, because it's taken a long time to get all of these 300 sectors or parts of the economy to get enforcement mechanisms and stuff like that. It's going to be a big, thick agreement, and I don't think we could have done it 18 months ago. I think this is if we get a partial deal, and it's on stopping stealing of technology, that is big. That's
but they
what
have to stick to it. Do you have any faith that they will stick to it?
Yes, because what the agreements that Bob Lighthizer has done is that they immediately get tariffs. Now, if you're asking, are we going to put the tariffs on? Well, that's our fault if we don't. But we are.
So they don't stick to certain levels. The tariffs go into.
Well, if they steal technology or force transfer in a particular area, it goes to a quick arbitration that's independent, not the WTO. And then if we win, we can put the.
But is this as important now as it was in the beginning? Have we moved on from here, looking at other issues, the economy itself? Both economies have weakened a little bit. China's, a lot of companies have moved out of China, right? Spread the wealth around.
But I still think it's as important now as it was when this all started. I mean, I do think enforcement is going to be critical. I also wonder, are we going to be seeing something like NAFTA, where the president spent they negotiated a deal, but when you look at it, it doesn't look that different from the original deal. And so if we don't see, I know you're saying small is big, and I get that, but I do think there's a question to be asked there for the president, both for the economy and politically.
The future of this country is on our technology. That's the crown jewels, and we have to protect them. And
I think you're missing something bigger. The future is the McRib, the McDonald's McRib. And I'm happy to say, in the middle of all this fighting, the McRib is coming back, I think, for a limited time. You strike me as a very healthy eater. Actually, you all strike me as healthy. I was amazed to see with the McRib when it first came out. Those aren't real ribs in the...
But boy, are they good.
They're very good.
They are
so
tasty.
good.
And I mean, I got to tip my hat to McDonald's, who's outperformed the Dow for the last 5 years.
They really have. Nice dividend.
Absolutely. And they're able to come out with these new things and get the free publicity, like us sitting around the table talking about that. And of course, there's still something that's
I'm only mentioning it because they said they would send 100 to me right now. No, I'm joking.
Only 100?
It was 50.
That's a small deal, Neil.
I saw them coming out with it. I went to McDonald's yesterday. I had 2 McRibs for lunch yesterday.
Did you really? They're only in certain restaurants, right, for the time being?
The one I was in, it was in, and it was
You
so
won't let your
good.
kids touch this stuff, right?
I've never had a McRib.
What are you doing here?
I'm sorry. When they send you 100,
That's
can I try one?
un-American.
Oh, man.
I've never had
I remember vividly, my wife and I showed her with this one, and she says, those aren't real ribs. I said, yeah. She looked at me as if I was an alien creature, like gobbling this thing done.
It's pork.
It's pork, yes.
Good.
It's a good meat.
I'm going to try it now.
All right. You don't do this at the economic times, my friends. The McRib is back. All is right with the world, or most of it. A little more after this. All right, earnings expectations for the S&P 500. Look at the S&P, again, a decline of about 2.2%. If you're looking at others, all sorts of estimates, they're going to be down. That's the guesstimate there, as much as 5%, as little as 1.5%, but they're going to be down. That's the expectation. Stanford School of Business lecturer Dave Dotson on why he thinks that might be the case. What do you think?
Well, I think there's a lot of evidence that the economy is softening. You know, we tend to look at these two things. We look at the jobs report, right, and then we look at the GDP growth rate. But that's all things that's happened in the past. But there's a lot of clues in these reports that tell you about what's going to happen in the future. So, for example, when I get the jobs report, one of the things I look at is overtime. So corporate overtime hours that are being offered to employees is down by almost 10% this year. You know, that's really an indication of some softening in the economy. You know, the GDP growth rate, I mean, that's just kind of a fancy way of saying how much stuff we're buying. Well, if you want to know how much stuff we're going to be buying next month, look at how consumers are paying for the things they bought this month. And if you look at default rates on auto loans, if you look at credit card balances, if you look at the percent of people who are paying off their credit cards, all of that's indicating that people are starting to struggle with paying for the things that they bought this year.
Before I extend this to my panelists here who are eager to talk to you, Dave, but one of the things that's come up is the uncertainty of trade, that a lot of companies don't know how to handicap that, so they just put it out there as potential headwinds they're facing, and they've been sort of battening down the financial hatches. What do you think of that?
I mean, it's really dreadful for these companies that have complex manufacturing supply chains. I mean, these are supply chains that got created over decades, and they're very intricate, and now they're being sort of dismantled in ways that are very disruptive. Now, in the short term, they're disruptive economically because everything becomes more expensive, and then you add tariffs on top of it. You know, that's going to have a lot of negative pressure on earnings. But long term, you know, what business likes, and everybody knows this, what business likes is they like certainty. They like to know what's going to happen. And there is so much uncertainty happening in Washington, D.C. I mean, it's maddening for companies.
Dave, this is Paul Dietrich, and in looking at that jobs report, it seemed like a lot of the overtime going down came out of manufacturing. And manufacturing is only 10% of the U.S. economy. 70% of the U.S. economy is consumer spending, and you know, jobs are still growing, wages are still growing. I think next quarter is going to be really good. That's usually the consumer quarter. And so I was wondering whether we put too much emphasis. There's no question that manufacturing is in decline, but that overtime, I agree with you. The overtime shows where we're going, but I think it shows more where we're going in manufacturing than in the overall economy. What do you think?
And there is so much uncertainty happening in Washington, D.C. I mean, it's maddening for companies.
Dave, this is Paul Dietrich, and in looking at that jobs report, it seemed like a lot of the overtime going down came out of manufacturing. And manufacturing is only 10% of the U.S. economy. 70% of the U.S. economy is consumer spending, and you know, jobs are still growing, wages are still growing. I think next quarter is going to be really good. That's usually the consumer quarter. And so I was wondering whether we put too much emphasis. There's no question that manufacturing is in decline, but that overtime, I agree with you. The overtime shows where we're going, but I think it shows more where we're going in manufacturing than in the overall economy. What do you think?
Well, Paul, I agree with you that, you know, you can't just look at manufacturing. The number that I looked at lines up with what you were thinking, which is it's the total overtime, both service, mining, manufacturing. So I was looking at the total number, which came down by 9.5%. But the income is also an interesting number because, you know, we tend to look at the income as the change in the wage rate. But what's really important for a wage earner is what their paycheck looks like, right? And if they're getting less overtime, and by the way, number of hours has come down so far this year, their paycheck is smaller, and that's lost in those numbers of what the wage rates are. And so if I am a shift worker at Best Buy, or I work in a mine, and my wages went up by 6% this year, but the number of overtime hours that I got were dropped by 10%, that's a reduction in my income.
I thought in that report that they actually said that most, not all of it certainly, but the decline in overtime was primarily in the manufacturing sector. It was certainly overweighted.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, it's a maddeningly difficult report because there's 30 different line items there. And when I was looking at the line items, it looked to me like there were two places that were getting hit hard. One was manufacturing, Paul, as you said, but the other was in the service sector.
Hi, Dave. It's Jeannie Zaino. I wanted to ask you, if the news we're hearing today about, say, we do get a short-term deal out of the administration vis-a-vis China, how much would that change sort of your forecast in terms of what you expect to see in the next quarter or next year?
Well, Jeannie, it's interesting you asked that way, because my feeling in the next quarter or next year would be, optimistic. I think everybody would breathe a massive sigh of relief, and we could sort of get back to business as usual, and I think there would be more political stability. However, my worry is, what is that long term? Because I can't see a world right now where China is going to be making painful concessions to the United States right now. Because given our political situation and given that we have an election coming up, I can't imagine why China would make, those kind of concessions. So what I worry about is not the next quarter, next year, but I worry about maybe what's going to happen in the next decade with that trade relationship. And of course, that's what the president has been focused so hard on, is trying to fix the long-term relationship between the United States economy and the Chinese economy.
So, hi, David. It's David Dietz. As we say on Wall Street, it's not just a market, it's a market of sectors. So are there some sectors that you're a little bit more optimistic on and others that you're more cautious on?
Well, I don't really have that's a fair question, David. I really don't have a point of view on which sectors might go up or down over the next quarter or so. But here's an issue that I am, speaking of sectors, here's an issue that I am sort of interested in, which is, if there's a recession or if there's a downturn, we know that all downturns aren't the same. So in 2008, it hit the homeowners who had mortgages. It hit them disproportionately hard because they had big mortgages. This downturn is likely to hit 18 to 30-year-olds disproportionately hard because the student loan rate is 183% of what it was before. So here's the interesting sort of political economic cocktail that we may be staring down. One is, if there's a downturn or a recession, it's going to hit them way harder. By the way, their unemployment rate is 4 times the national average. It's going to hit them harder. That's piece number one. Piece number two is, over the last 10 years, that sector has become very disenchanted with the system. And in fact, the favorability of capitalism among that group has gone from 64% in 10 years down to 45%. So they don't believe in the system. Now, here's the last piece. Tufts University just recently released some interesting data about student voting. Student voting in the midterm elections in 2018 doubled from 19% to 40%. It doubled. So now you've got a cohort going into the 2020 election who have a very different viewpoint on the economic policy, and it's more far-left economic policy. I actually think that could translate into U.S. policy over the next 4 to 8 years.
I don't know what's more remarkable there, Dave, that a guy from Stanford is quoting a Tufts survey, or that we have to really worry about that. Always good having you, Professor. Thank you for taking the time.
Yes, sir.
All right. Let's bring on our panel on all this. Iona College political science professor Jeannie Zaino. We've got Fairfax Global Markets CEO Paul Dietrich, and Point View Wealth Management President David Dietz. David, if we are showing some flexibility on a trade deal, maybe for a sort of a partial deal, I guess that's the popular vernacular, how do you think the street takes that?
Well, I think the street takes it very positively, because anything that can somehow either push back and delay tariffs or reduce what we've got is obviously a big boost to the bottom line, and that's what Wall Street cares about.
Sure. Money, money, money.
There you go.
Money, money, money. Jeannie, what do you think of that?
I think that's true, and I think, part of the concern here is just what you mentioned. You have Larry Kudlow saying something which helps boost the markets, and yet we know we have a president who oftentimes will say contradictory things, and that's just what the market doesn't need.
He goes rogue when he's the rogue guy, right? Yeah.
You said that, not me.
Paul, what do you think of it? So if we're back to considering a limited deal, which might be the smart way to go because some of these are thornier, bigger issues, we could have had that 18 months ago.
I'm not so sure. I mean, when you start out with trade negotiations, you throw everything in, and then you narrow. And if you talk to the people who are on the, and I was talking last week to some of the trade negotiators in Washington, and they were basically saying, look, we've always known that there are some priorities, and the priorities for Bob Lighthizer are to have tough enforcement. Whether they change their laws or not, he has developed mechanisms that will go into effect, and if they cheat, if they steal our technology, if they force transfer of technology, technology. It goes to an arbitrator, and then we can put on immediate tariffs. We don't have to go through the World Trade Organization, which takes forever. And if we can get that through...
And the Chinese would honor that?
It doesn't matter whether they honor it or not. If they cheat,
it does.
No. If they cheat, they feel the pain immediately. They've never felt the pain with the World Trade Organization. They cheat. We win in the World Trade Organization, and 10 years later, nothing has changed because they keep appealing the ruling. That's not possible.
That's something they would have to stick, right? They would have to do whatever they're saying. I know the Chinese are pretty clever at avoiding that. Maybe there is language here in the deal that ultimately is formed that does that. What if there's not?
Well, I think there has to be. The question is whether they're going to observe it. But certainly, if they agree to some clear-cut rules, it's going to be easier to get public opinion, even world opinion, to go back after China.
Do you think they care about public opinion, world opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why they're concerned about the tweets from the general manager of the Houston Rockets. I mean, sure they do. And that's
I was more offended by how, you know, this poor guy had to apologize for those comments and dial them back. We're still sucking up to them.
Oh, absolutely. And you have seen, I mean, this guy, I guess, is still hanging on to his job, but I wouldn't be surprised if he can't do that much longer. I mean, he has been hit terribly by this. And a tweet, let's not forget, that was defending Democratic protesters. And you see how swift that was from the NBA, from the Rockets.
But that's my point, that we are still playing this game where a lot of American CEOs, American interests, you know, walk on eggshells with China.
Well, look, we're all for human rights. I was struck by the difference in how the Hong Kong media, when I was reading the South China Post this morning, how they were dealing with this and the U.S. media is dealing with it. Even the pro-protester media in Hong Kong is kind of rolling their eyes at this statement. I mean, it's like if the general manager of a British soccer team criticized New York and Chicago police on how they were handling protesters.
We're going to explore this more. I'm not really offended by how the Chinese react. I'm offended more by how we are handling that. But leaving that aside, I'm just wondering, if the optimism is there that a trade deal can be scored, does it matter the kind of deal to you, or just that we got uncertainty out of the way?
Well, certainly you want to see concession on the part of the Chinese. You want them to drop tariffs that they have on our goods, that they're going to boost imports of agricultural goods. So, yeah.
But what if they only bring agricultural imports up to the level they were prior?
Well, I mean, you know, I think they're going to promise a lot more than that. The reality is what actually happens. And at this point, of course, they've already set up new trade chains with Brazil and other places. I don't think you're going to see it all the way back to where it was.
All right, so switch it around now. Whatever people think about China, the United States or their trade positions, is it your sense that China has been hurting? We've seen our economy stumbling, that the bang for the buck, or the yen, or I'm sorry, the yuan, is such that it might be too late. What do you think?
I do not think it is too late. I mean, I do think that they could come up with a deal. I think still my big question...
And help the global economy, help remove the uncertainty that so many...
Some of the uncertainty. I wouldn't say help remove all the uncertainty, but some of it, and at least make people feel a bit more optimistic. But I do think a big question here remains the uncertainty of our president. I mean, you're talking about what Lighthouser wants, but is the president going to go along with a partial deal and be able to sell that politically as a big win? I mean, this is a guy who said he is the king deal maker. If you're talking a small deal, you know, he can, you know, try to sell that, but I don't know if that helps him.
You know, he's going to sell this deal because
he needs it.
Technology is the crown jewels of the American economy and going forward. And if he gets that, alone, and we are able to put tariffs on immediately any cheating that goes on in that sector, that's a deal he can sell. I'll take it.
Do his own negotiators feel like they can sell this to the president?
Yes.
Because it's long felt like there has been a sort of a divide there where they feel like they're making progress and the president hasn't.
He's ripped up many a deal.
Many a deal, yeah.
He's not going to rip up a deal that's going to save American technology and stop them from cheating. That was the main priority always, and that's something he can sell.
But let's go beyond that. Even a small deal does make a lot of sense, because look what's happened. We have diversified our reliance on China. Already some of these changed supplies have gone to other countries like Vietnam. Also, we have new respect in terms of our negotiations with Mexico, Canada, and Europe. People realize America means business in terms of leveling out the trade field. So I think this exercise is worthwhile.
All right, these guys have done nothing to help stocks, though. As you know, we started this essentially being flat, and now we're down 44 points. Great job, guys.